An invasion defined by mistakes and miscalculations. A war that set drones against tanks and front lines both on the ground and online. Tonight, Ukraine's modern war. Good evening, welcome to the Imperial War Museum in London. Generations of conflicts are remembered, recorded and retold here, with experts comparing what happened in the First and Second World Wars with more recent conflicts in the Balkans, Iraq and Afghanistan. In future, the war happening right now in Ukraine will likely be documented here too. But what lessons are being learned from this war? What, if anything, defines this conflict from those of the past? And as the nuclear rhetoric rises, could this be the start of a new global conflict? Tonight we'll discuss how we got here and what could happen next, alongside Sky News correspondents who have witnessed the ferocity, the fear, the heartache of this war. Deborah Haynes has spent more than 20 weeks in Ukraine at various stages since the conflict began. We'll also hear tonight from Stuart Ramsey, John Sparks and Diana Magnay. Military expert Michael Clark has analysed every twist and turn, of which there have been many, as Russia advanced and Ukraine fought back. And Carl Warner is principal curator here at the Imperial War Museum and a Cold War specialist. Plus, in his first interview since stepping down as Prime Minister, I have spoken exclusively to Boris Johnson for a candid take on the war so far and why he thinks Putin would be crazy to launch a nuclear strike.
I think what would happen is that he would immediately tender Russia's resignation from the Club of Civilized Nations.
That interview coming up in full a little later. We also have a 150-strong audience here too, and our panel are primed and ready to answer your questions tonight. But let's begin with a look at how this war has unfolded. It's been 8 months since the first Russian missiles struck cities across Ukraine in the early hours of February the 24th. It was the first invasion of a sovereign state in Europe since the Second World War and has caused death, destruction, devastation, but also incredible bravery and resilience.
The shelling is very close.
The wreckage of Russian vehicles is littering this street.
It's World War III.
Here we go.
It started before dawn.
Can you hear that, Mark?
It's the only way out of Irpin, and this would test even the fit and healthy. But those still fleeing are the most vulnerable, the elderly, the frail and the very young.
There's no water, no electricity. They're still hanging on. I don't know how they're doing it, but they are.
They are going west to safety. He will now head east to fight.
There is going to be one almighty crush as people try to get on.
Rats going up behind you now.
Whatever fell from the sky made a crater this big.
Alex Crawford from Sky News.
Close the sky and stop bombing. Don't speak about the bureaucratic steps.
It's a professional ambush.
Now.
The bullets just don't miss.
Whoa! Whoa! Journalist!
The five of us have made it out of the car, down the embankment, and we just can't believe we're alive.
Good evening from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv.
You can see what's left of the missile here. The words on the side of that, Zadeti, it means for children.
The train station was packed with people trying to find a way out.
This is what it's like in Kharkiv every day now.
A mass grave here triggered global horror.
These boys are out every day protecting their village, or what's left of it, with their own checkpoint and toy guns.
At first, we were scared, really scared. But now we are ready to fight. Fight like hell.
So through here, they're making the Molotov cocktails.
Vladimir Putin thought that Russian forces would capture Kyiv within days. They failed. Instead, his forces are bogged down in a war that they're unwilling to leave and so far incapable of winning.
In war, it is always the children. Always the children displaced. Always the children without a say in what adults are doing to their world.
It is always the children. Well, in the next 90 minutes, we're going to examine 4 key questions for tonight's event in partnership with the Imperial War Museum Institute. Has Ukraine changed modern warfare? Yes, there are tanks and troops, but also drones and apps. So how has this war been different? Then the big issue right now, will Putin go nuclear? He says he's not bluffing, but is that a step too far, even for him? And finally, winter is coming, but what happens next? Are we in for a protracted conflict, or is there any prospect of peace in the coming months? But first up, who is winning the war? Right now, it may seem like Ukraine are on top as it mounts a counteroffensive, but it's been a conflict with ups and downs on both fronts, of course. Let's start then with the invasion, and it's fair to say that most observers did not expect a full-scale incursion. Deborah, first of all, we were there when it all began. How shocked were you when it actually happened?
I think from the UK and the US side, they were the two countries that had been saying, contrary to most other allies, that Putin had the intention to launch a full-scale invasion. You'll remember there were all those troops, more than 100,000 troops massing at the border. So I think because we'd been having these briefings in my head, I knew that it was coming. But in reality, when you're seeing a country like Ukraine with people in the streets, I remember on the 23rd of February being in a main street in Kyiv, watching through the window of this beautiful boutique coffee shop with young women having a little catch-up around a coffee table, eating cake and drinking coffee. And literally then, in the early hours of the next morning, the news that the war had begun. And it was so profoundly shocking to see a country and be there as it goes from relative peace. Of course, it had been in a state of war since 2014, but from relative peace to all-out war and all the carnage that then followed.
We were in Kharkiv, and we were actually filming in a theatre 3 or 4 days before the invasion. Michael, were you surprised by Putin's miscalculation, which it clearly was? I mean, it began catastrophically. Was it complacency, military naivety, or sheer incompetence, or all three?
It was interesting beforehand, when we thought something was bound to happen, because he wasn't just massing troops, they were bringing medical units to the front and blood to the medical units. That told us about a week before that you don't take blood to an exercise unless you expect to do some fighting. So we knew something was going to happen. And I think most of us thought, if he's really reckless, he might just try and push this land bridge between the Donbass towards Crimea. That would be a very reckless thing to do, but he might just be mad enough to do that. In the event, he went for broke, trying to take the whole country in 3 days. And that was the idea, to replace the government in Kyiv, to get the whole operation finished by the 8th of March, and simply take the country over. And it was truly astonishing. And the reality was, if it didn't succeed quickly, it wouldn't succeed. That's the point. If the plan A didn't work, plan B, C, and D will not work either. So Putin is not a loser, but he won't lose gracefully. And that's where we are. It's an impossible job that he has given himself. And yes, it was a huge surprise. I mean, some of us never thought that we would live long enough to see Europe plunged into this sort of aggressive war of an invasion, an aggressive war of conquest, in the foreseeable future. We thought it might happen eventually, but by eventually, sometime late into this century, not 2022.
So, Carl, let's talk about why it's happening. Is this, as we were discussing earlier, is this part of Vladimir Putin's obsession with the collapse of the Soviet Union and this desire for some greater Russia?
I think there's definitely an extent to which that's a part of it. I think there is a distressingly pragmatic and geographical and geopolitical reason for the kind of the focus on Ukraine. Ukraine's position geographically. There tends to be a reason, or a couple of reasons why authoritarian leaders tend to focus on the taking over other sovereign states, and that's either because they occupy an extraordinarily important strategic position. So the significance of Ukraine over the last 100 years, even before that, in terms of the access from west to east, the Soviet desire to have this kind of buffer zone, this distance from Moscow to the areas where the West could invade. All of those things, warm water ports in Crimea, there are these sort of distressingly pragmatic reasons that at the bottom of it mean that Putin is the sort of leader that ends up treating a sovereign nation as a piece on a board. And that's very much the kind of the way that sort of the grand narrative of politics throughout the Cold War and much earlier tended to play out, where certain nations were seen not because of their what they bring, although having said that, Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. So if you have a view of the world that lasts 100 years and you're looking at the future of resource conflict, all of these things come into play. But at the root of it is this concept of the greater Russia that is being created and forged.
So let's look at the key battles. There was the fight for Kyiv, of course, Kherson falling, the siege of Mariupol, the battle for Severodonetsk, several key battles during the war. Deborah, a lot seemed to happen very quickly. Which battle do you think was the most significant?
I think for me, the battle for Kyiv was the most significant so far, just because that was the moment. You'll remember, like in the run-up to the invasion, and even in the immediate aftermath, the widespread belief amongst government officials and experts in the UK and across the West was that Russia was this mighty military that would squash Ukraine, much as we wouldn't want to see that, and that it would be a very, that the Ukraine would try really hard, would fight hard, but ultimately Russia would succeed to some extent. No one really believed that they would manage with the force that they'd chosen to use against Ukraine, that they would manage to take the capital and conquer the whole country. But there was a belief that, for example, the Donbass would fall quickly, and potentially parts of the southeast, or the rest of the southeast. But I think that the battle for Kyiv showed, actually, Ukraine not only wants to fight, but it can fight. And as well as that, it showed the West, finally, after years of absolute complacency and absolute failure to recognise the existential threat posed by Vladimir Putin's Russia and to address that. We had the invasion of Ukraine in the beginning, back in 2014. We had the Skripal poisonings on our streets, the multiple warning signs, and yet NATO allies, the UK, hadn't responded significantly. And suddenly, when Putin did act, the West did respond. You had not only the sanctions, but the weapons. And then the Ukrainians using these weapons effectively, so effectively that you'll remember that long column of Russian armour that was moving slowly towards Kyiv. It stopped, it moved so slowly, and then it got pushed back. And then that really, in terms of just the motivation for Ukraine and for the West to see that it isn't impossible to beat this giant, we can do it, I think that was really key.
Yeah, it arrived very slowly and it left a bit more quickly, didn't it? Michael, which was the significant battle for you?
Well, I agree that the failure to take Kyiv was critical to setting up the fact that this is going to be a longer war. For me, the most interesting battle was Mariupol, because Mariupol was a city that should have fallen within the first 72 hours. It was right on the border of the Donetsk People's Republic. It was a apparently a pro-Russian city before this crisis. Big steelworks there, the Avastal steelworks, and a separate one. So one of the biggest steel areas of Europe, strategically quite important in relation to the land bridge to Crimea. And yet, it didn't fall in the first 72 hours. It was 3 months before it fell. And the fact that it couldn't be relieved, the nearest Ukrainian troops were about 60 miles away. It was clearly going to be taken eventually, but it tied up an awful lot of Russian forces while they were trying to take it. And it was indicative of this David and Goliath struggle. And it made a huge impression, I think, on the world outside. And when the Ukrainians were ordered by Kyiv to stop fighting, the commander of the 36th Marine Infantry Brigade, the Marines, he said, think of us kindly when you think of the Marines. He said, we did all that was possible and quite a lot that was impossible. And now we're finished. And that was a good line, very good line. And even a couple of weeks ago, in a prisoner exchange that you and I talked about, I think, the women of Avastal, the Avastal steelworks that held out in the tunnels endlessly, it seemed, the women of Avastal were exchanged in a prisoner exchange. And when the exchange took place, they were coming away from the exchange point in ranks of 4. They weren't exactly marching, but they were walking in step with their heads held high. And that was the message. We are the women of Avastal. You better take some notice of us. We are unbowed. And so I think the Mariupol battle, although it was a defeat for the Ukrainians, it was the sort of defeat upon which national mythologies are built. And the Ukraine that emerges from this war, I'm sure, will be a very different Ukraine to the Ukraine of 2014 and certainly pre-2014. And Mariupol and Avastal will be two of the symbols, the defeats that mattered so much to the spirit that the Ukrainians are now showing. So very important, I think.
By the way, if you're at home hearing a rustling sound, it's because the heavens have opened on the roof of the Imperial War Museum. But Deborah, the sort of battle for Kyiv that wasn't over, there was then this pushing back, and we started hearing about places like Bucha and those other places north of Kyiv, and the stories then started emerging of the brutality of what had happened and the war crimes.
That was really hard to believe, the reality of what had been done in these places where Russian forces had been occupying. You'll remember when, after the Russians announced this strategic withdrawal, didn't they? Sort of reshifting down into the Donbass, whereas actually it was spinning the retreat in the face of Ukraine's resistance. And after they were pushed back, we, the journalists, were able to move forward into these areas. And I remember the journalists first going into Bucha and seeing bodies on the street. This mass grave that was found in the grounds of a church, and then the stories of absolute horror from the people who had survived, and evidence of what almost seemed like systematic executions of certain individuals, military-aged males, Russian soldiers literally going from house to house, checking people's mobile phones. If they had images on the phones that they didn't like, these people might disappear. Evidence of torture, evidence of rape, horrific stories that were, like I said, in this day and age, really hard to report on and realise they were true.
And are still coming out stories from different towns and villages as they're liberated. Well, I think we can go now to Ukraine, and we have our correspondent, John Sparks, who can join us, I think, from Odessa. There he is. John, good evening to you. So just bring us up to date as best you can with the latest on this Ukrainian counter-offensive.
Good evening, Mark. Look, the Ukrainians are still making advances, but they are incremental advances. The situation is different than what we saw in September, when they took large amounts of territory, particularly in the region of Kharkiv. It's much more incremental now in the east, in the south, and in other places it is a frontier, a front line of 1,000 kilometers in length. In other places they are just holding the line. I mean, we've been speaking to commanders, we've been speaking to troops as well. They blame the weather, in part, the autumnal rains. In fact, they've got a name for it, Bazdareja, which actually means bad roads. But they are having trouble getting around in many of these agricultural areas, and they're actually waiting for winter when movement should be easier. We went to the front lines today near Kherson, the western side of the city of Kherson. We found the troops there dug in trenches and tunnels as well, using this First World War technology, actually quite handy in terms of protecting themselves from drones and precision munitions. But they said, look, we are making small gains, not a huge amount, but they do expect at some point to be inside the city of Kherson, so optimistic.
And you were there, we were there together at the beginning of the war. You're there now. What's changed? What's different in your view?
Yeah, Mark, I mean, I remember speaking to you from the rooftop of a hotel in Kharkiv just after the Russians started to shell the city. And I was shocked, I think, like a lot of people from Kharkiv. We went to bed the night before just simply not believing that the Russians would do this. And they did, and the shelling got so close that I had to take myself off the rooftop, I think, while I was actually speaking to you. So really shocked, and I think the following days, the following weeks really went in a blur for me. It was very difficult to grasp what was happening in many ways. It's a total tragedy. It's a catastrophe in one way for Ukraine. Thousands of people have lost their lives. The World Bank has put a price on the damage that's been done so far of $300 billion to rebuild. That's so far, and as we know, the war could run for a long time. But I think I should say, I think the war has bound this country together. If there were political questions, economic questions, questions about Ukraine's existence, there aren't now. I think people are really, really committed. They are Ukrainians. They want to live in Ukraine. It has brought this country together.
Okay, John Sparks there in Odessa. Thank you very much indeed. Well, since the summer, the war has been characterized by the fight back from Ukrainian forces, with Russia losing ground in the east and the south of the country. Michael, you know, we've seen you on Sky News most nights bringing us analysis. What do you think the situation is now on the ground, particularly in the south and the east?
As we speak now, the Russians have got two big pressure points to worry about. And although, as John Sparks said, both offensives in the northeast and in the southwest have paused a little bit, but they paused for all sorts of good reasons. They go in fits and starts. In the northeast, the Russians are trying to hold on to Svatove, the town of Svatove, south to Kremina, and that's the P66 highway. Since the Russians were pushed east of the Oskil River, they're holding on to that highway as their defense line. That highway is already under real pressure. And if they lose that highway, which I think they will, then they're probably going to have to pull back to Starobilsk, which is another 40 miles to the east. And they'll try to create some new lines there. So I think the Ukrainians are pushing, and I think they'll push the Russians a bit further east yet before this offensive comes to an end. And in the southwest, of course, it's all about Kherson. And the Ukrainians have said, they originally said they'd take Kherson by the end of September. They now say they'll take it by the end of November. Well, we'll see. But I think they will take it. And they might do it in an assault on Kherson from the west. More likely, they're moving south from Milove, which they occupy pretty well at the moment, down to Novokakhovka, which is where the big dam and the hydroelectric power plant is. And I think this battle in Kherson will be decided by what happens at Novokakhovka. The Russians might blow the dam in order to flood the rest of the Dnipro plain. They might, and that would be a catastrophe. But that will dominate what happens next. But I think that the Ukrainians will succeed. I think they'll take Novokakhovka. They may take Kherson this side of the winter, but if not, I think they will definitely take it. And I think the Russians want to withdraw to the east of the Dnipro River, in order to establish more solid lines to protect this land bridge. Because ultimately, if they lose contact with this land bridge between the Donbass and Crimea, then they've lost the basic rationale, which they've now established for what this war is supposed to be all about.
So a pivotal few weeks ahead as winter draws.
I think so. And I mean, winter's miserable for everybody in battle. By and large, it favours the defence over the offence. By and large, it's easier to hold positions in the miserable weather than it is to keep attacking. But As we said, when the ground is hard, then armoured vehicles can move around much more easily. But in general, the Russians want the winter to come because it'll make their lives a bit easier. The Ukrainians want to get something before the winter sets in, but this battle won't stop. It'll just go on a different tempo during the winter.
OK, Michael, thanks very much indeed. Well, of course, civilians caught up in the war live in almost permanent fear of attack. Just driving down a road at the wrong time can be a death sentence. And after just 5 days of war, that was illustrated when a Sky News team was ambushed by an advance party of Russian soldiers, their car destroyed as they came under sustained machine gun fire. Stuart Ramsey was shot in the lower back, the bullet passing through his body, with his body armour taking 6 more rounds. This is what happened.
Okay. Oh. Whoa! Whoa! What the f***? Whoa! Stop! Where the f*** is everyone? Yeah. Where is everyone? Here. Stop! Say British. British journalist! British! British journalists! 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 Journalista!
Well, Stuart Ramsey joins us now from Sao Paulo in Brazil, where he's been covering the elections going on there. And Stuart, it's good to talk to you. And I mean, that ambush, I gather you went back to Ukraine, to the scene of that ambush. Tell us what that was like. And of course, it just gives people an idea of the kind of thing that civilians are putting up with in Ukraine day in, day out.
Yeah, firstly, that's really important, actually, Mark, and that's really why that report is important and why it was filed, because we were on the M06, which is the western approach to Kyiv. The investigators into what they consider to be a crime against us by the Russians, they believe that the Russians intended that to be the main way for their tanks, that we were talking about that huge column, that was the way they were going to try to get into to the city. Now, the M06 they needed cleared. We're one of the first cars that were unfortunate enough to be ambushed, but there were dozens more over next sort of a campaign, we think, of about 2 weeks, and lots of civilians were either killed or certainly injured. We did go back. It was quite strange going back to the bridge that we basically stopped on. We had to drive underneath it because they'd found a way through. It had been blown. That's why we firstly came to a stop. And then we went to see where our car was. The police took us away, and there were literally hundreds of cars that had been destroyed by the Russians, and they were in there. So it was quite an experience to go back and see it. I have to say, Mark, you know, listening to the audio of it just then, it is always quite depressing. I cannot believe that we were able to escape from that vehicle. The point being, of course, is that, A, we do quite a lot of training, and we're all wearing body armour. The difference for the civilians, families, which we know were killed, is that they are not trained and they're not wearing any body armour. And so once those bullets and rounds start coming in, you know, they're going to die. And that is why we were fortunate. That's why we lived. And this was happening in a number of locations. There had been reports a couple of days before that this was happening, but this was an indicator that the Russians were and will continue to attack civilians if they get in their way.
And Stuart, you've spent the past decade really reporting from Ukraine. Before the fall of Crimea, you reported down in the south and east quite a lot. Also, the Georgian and Chechen wars you covered. Have Russian tactics, in your view, changed at all?
No, they certainly haven't. Well, in the early part, and the way that sort of violence that you saw that we got caught up in and what happened in Bucha was sort of different. But if you look at the use of heavy weapons like we used to see in Grozny, where they're just basically flattening towns. Well, we saw that in Mariupol, and it's exactly the same tactic that they've used before. And I haven't seen an awful lot of change. One of the things I found being in Chechnya with the Russians, as well as the Chechen separatists, that they weren't very good. And I think we all thought, I think Deborah was saying that earlier, that everyone assumed that the Russians had actually built themselves up and that they were now better equipped and that they would be able to pretty much steamroller the Ukrainians out of the way. What's quite clear, that to me at least, is the tactics hadn't changed, and in fact quite a lot of their kit hadn't changed either, and they're actually not very well organised either. We know, for example, that their own communication systems in the early part of the war failed almost instantly, and they were using Ukrainian mobile phones, which of course, and Russian mobile phones, which the Ukrainians could identify. So they weren't very good, but that tactic of just basically smashing up a town and then moving forward, they're still doing, and they did it in Chechnya and they're doing it now.
OK, Stuart, thanks very much indeed. We'll let you get on with your work there in Brazil. Thank you very much. Let's have a look in a little more detail at what has happened so far during this war. If you want to do that, go to the Sky News website or app. There you can see a detailed timeline of the key events and also watch Sky News reports from the front line in our Ukraine War Interactive. You can also scan the QR code on the screen right now to go to it. Think of it as a sort of digital exhibition, the likes of which you may see here at the Imperial War Museum in years to come. Now, he may be a somewhat divisive figure here in Britain, but to the people of Ukraine, Boris Johnson is held in high esteem, so much so that he was awarded its highest civilian honour for foreign nationals, the Order of Liberty. He was the first G7 leader to visit Kyiv after the end of the siege following Russia's invasion, and has spoken repeatedly about the importance of British support for Ukraine. But what were those early days of the invasion really like, and does he have any regrets? I sat down with the former Prime Minister this afternoon here at the Imperial War Museum for an exclusive interview. Boris Johnson, Vladimir Putin thought that this war would be over in days.
In a week or so, yeah.
Did you fear the same?
That was certainly the advice that we were getting, and some of the defence intelligence people were saying, look, this is going to be very, very one-sided. The Russians are just going to roll through, and numerically they're so strong and they're so well equipped. I'd been to Ukraine a few times before, and I kind of knew that they were going to fight. And if you've been there a lot, and you talk to people who've fought in the east in Donbass since 2014, these are hardened fighters. So I thought it would be much tougher than Putin thought.
Do you think that now they could be on the verge of victory?
I think it's absolutely inevitable that the Ukrainians will eventually win. I'll tell you why. Because this is a war of independence, and wars of independence only really end one way. And the crucial thing for us all who believe in this cause, who believe that the cause of Ukrainian freedom is all of our cause, we just have to show strategic patience and continue to support them.
What does that victory look like?
Through this winter and beyond.
What does that victory look like, though?
I think the exact contours of victory are very much up to the Ukrainians. We can't be more Ukrainian than the Ukrainians. Passionately, though, we may support them. It's up to them. It's up to Volodymyr Zelensky to decide. I would have thought that it's going to be very difficult for anything to be acceptable that stops short of a full return of all the areas taken by the Russians since February the 24th this year.
Right, so could you see any solution that allowed Putin to keep Crimea and all or most of the annexed areas?
No, frankly. I think Crimea is a slightly separate issue, but it's for the Ukrainians. It's not for us to decide.
Do you think that Vladimir Putin is running out of options?
I think that Putin disastrously miscalculated, and a we kind of, in the UK government, we all read his crackers essay on Ukraine summer of last year, and we could see that he fundamentally misunderstood what Ukraine is. It was like reading Slobodan Milosevic on the subject of Kosovo, which I'm sure you remember well. Slobo basically thought Kosovo was an integral part of Greater Serbia and the spiritual homeland, the origins of the Serb nation. And I think that's how Putin thought about Kievan Rus and the origins of the Orthodox faith and all the rest of it. And it's a total category error. Ukraine is a free, independent European culture with its own identity, its own ambitions, its own destiny. And he made a fundamental mistake. And so, you know, he's
but if he is running out of
fighting nationalism.
But if he's running out of options, my point was about him being cornered. There's a lot of talk about tactical nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Do you think he would use them?
Well, first of all, let's look at your phrase. And he's running out of options, and he has, as a limit to what he can do. Don't forget, Mark, he's still overwhelmingly supported by, whether we believe his opinion polls or not, it's pretty clear that he's supported by the vast bulk of the Russian people. Yes, there's a bit of kind of fraying now in the media coverage, and I'm not saying it'd be easy for him, but there is a world in which he can say to the Russian people, look, we had a special operation. We needed to denazify Ukraine. We needed to make sure that it wasn't a haven for anti-Russian feeling, and that the Russian minorities were treated properly, and that the Russian language was protected and so on. We've achieved that. So, I mean, I think there is an option. It may sound crazy, but I think there is an option where he could...
And hold on to the places he's taken, like Kherson?
No, I don't think that's credible for him anymore. He will lose those.
But his position is he will not want to lose those. And my question was, do you fear that he could use a tactical nuclear weapon?
I don't think he will. I think he'd be crazy to do so.
Would it change the conflict if he did?
I think what would happen is that he would immediately tender Russia's resignation from the club of civilized nations. It would be a total disaster for his country. So the current economic punishment that the West has been able to dish out would be massively intensified. Russia would be put into a kind of cryogenic economic freeze. And I think he would lose a lot of the kind of middle ground of global tacit acquiescence that he's had. I mean, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, you look at Latin America, you look at Lula, for instance, who's just been elected again, look at South Asia. There's a lot of willingness to give Putin the benefit of the doubt. That will go the minute he does anything like that. He would also, crucially, I think, lose the patronage of the Chinese, and above all, in his own country, I think he would trigger an absolutely hysterical reaction. So I don't think that is a realistic
What would be the West's
option.
military response? Would there be a military response? There'd have to be a military response.
I think the crucial thing about strategic nuclear deterrence and the logic of it is you don't talk about what you would do, but clearly there would have to be a response of some kind.
But it wouldn't have to be nuclear. It could be a very large conventional response on his forces in Ukraine. Would that be something that he should expect?
There are all sorts of options that I know, we've talked about both in NATO and in the P3, the Western nuclear powers have talked about. There would clearly have to be a response. But as I say, I don't think it's going to. I think it's very, 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 very unlikely that it'll come to that. I think it's important that we don't, as it were, waste too much time on this conversation, because this is exactly how Putin wants to frame it. He wants to frame it as a standoff between a nuclear-armed Russia and a nuclear-armed NATO. And that's how he wants to to present it. It's not.
So
it's about a brutal invasion.
It's
about a brutal invasion of an innocent country by conventional means, and what we are providing is the conventional support that will enable the Ukrainians to win.
See, I just wonder how dangerous a moment you think this is for the world.
I think that this is a critical moment for the world, and I think it's a pivotal moment. It's a turning point. And I think the danger is that we will try to compromise and find some sort of deal, some grubby bargain with Putin, try to encourage the Ukrainians to trade some of their territory, which will only encourage Putin to make further aggression, as we've seen since 2014. But the prize for holding firm and continuing to support Ukraine is absolutely immense, because for the first time in decades, we'll have shown that we really believe in democracy and freedom, and that we're really willing to support it.
So I want to talk
those values in Europe. So a Ukrainian victory could be an absolute turning point for the world.
Just a final point on the nuclear threat. How much time, as Prime Minister, did you worry about the possibility that Vladimir Putin may use a nuclear weapon?
Well, for the reasons, Mark, that I've given, I think it's very important that we don't allow the whole debate to be framed in those terms, because that's he's like the fat boy in Dickens. He wants to make our flesh creep, right? He wants to spook everybody out with this conversation. I think it's far more important that we concentrate on the ways in which militarily, diplomatically, economically, we can ensure that the Ukrainians see the Russians off, get them out of their territory, and build an independent future.
Now, Ukraine is clearly personal to you. It clearly means a lot. I just wonder, why is that?
I was very lucky. I was Foreign Secretary in 2016, and one of the first things I did was go to Ukraine. And I remember talking to Ukrainians who'd been fighting in Donbass, and I remember going to see this great wall where they have, I'm sure you've seen it many times yourself, the pictures of the thousands and thousands of Ukrainian soldiers who've given their lives for the freedom and independence of their country. And I became very sympathetic to their cause. And I remember standing on that beautiful Acropolis in Kiev and talking about the possibility that Russia might be so insane as to take advantage of the fact that there was no security guarantee to Ukraine, because Ukraine was not given NATO membership, and clearly it was a problem.
Because my point is,
and that is what we now have to fix.
But my point is that 1 minute you were leading the world's response to Ukraine in many ways. The next minute, you were out of Downing Street and out of power. How did that feel?
I think that thankfully the UK has got an absolutely seamless continuity of policy, and Rishi, I know, had an excellent talk the other night with Volodymyr Zelensky, and we are going to continue flat out to support Ukraine and to make sure that we're there and give them everything they need. Now, if I can make a plug for what I think they need now, I talked to a friend in Kiev last night, and as you know, the lights are out. There's no water. They're having to queue for bottled water because they're getting these missile attacks on their electricity facilities, and it's absolutely inhumane. What the Ukrainians now need, and we've given them lots of great stuff, from starting with the anti-tank gun, the anti-tank missiles. What they need is more anti-aircraft kit, and ideally they need fixed-wing aircraft to take out the drones and the missiles.
But you don't regret losing that influence and losing that power, because in many ways, look, it was your own mistakes you made, and that deprived you of the influence and the power that you had over Ukraine. You must regret that, because that was something that was
yes,
clearly...
I mean, tempting as it is to... The most important thing is to focus not on me or my political career or whatever, but to focus on what matters.
All right, let me put it another way. Is turfing out prime ministers the right thing to be doing in the middle of the worst crisis, the worst conflict since the Second World War in Europe?
I think the important thing is for all of us, particularly in the United States, to remain focused on the needs of the Ukrainian people. And if I may say so, the UK, you're kind of what you said about the role of the UK. And I think it's true. We did play an important part, particularly at the beginning, but actually throughout, in bringing our friends together, in organising those great businesses where people donated arms.
I want to talk about the commitment. Let me just say,
the crucial thing is in North America. The vital thing is to make sure that our American friends remain committed.
I want to do that. Just finally on this, Zelensky was your friend. He is your friend. Very fond of you. They're even naming a street after you. In a sense, didn't you let them down by the mistakes that led to you leaving office?
I see what you mean. Look, I certainly want to do everything I can to help Ukraine, and that's always been, my commitment. I've said that to Volodymyr, irrespective of whether I'm in office or not. I think there are ways I can be useful. But for instance,
how would you be useful?
I think it's very important that America's been extraordinary. Joe Biden has been absolutely wonderful. And, people may not expect me to say that, but I think America, as so often, massively surprised on the upside. I mean, $45 billion, $12.5 billion worth of military equipment, the HIMARS, the rocket systems to take out Ukrainian, to take out Russian munitions.
Republicans could win the midterm elections, take over Congress, and they are saying there is no blank check for Ukraine.
Correct. That's what I saw. That's what my old friend Kevin McCarthy said the other day. And I think that actually, when you talk to individual Republicans, they see the vital importance of this struggle. But yeah, if I can be useful in trying to get over to people why I see this as such an absolutely critical test of Western will, then I think that'd be a good thing to do. But it's America that is crucial. America has given so much of the military support, so much of the economic support.
But do you worry that may now wane?
I think you've always got to be. It's a lot to ask of any country, particularly in tough economic times, and the Americans have been fantastic. I mean, the UK's given a huge amount as well. We've given a huge amount of money, huge amount of military assistance.
Do you see any future British government going soft on Ukraine, even on persuading Zelensky towards negotiations or persuading him to do a deal?
I would argue passionately against that, just for this reason, that I don't think, and I don't think it's likely to happen, but I just don't think it's realistic, because there's no deal that Zelensky can do, and there's no deal that Putin is offering.
There were reports that Rishi Sunak was trying to limit the amount of money that you were giving to Ukraine and the amount of support that you were giving to Ukraine. Is that true?
I think the UK's support has been, I was going to say second to none. It's been second to the Americans. Otherwise, it's been.
So he never tried to.
We've given a huge amount of financial support, and I think the decisive thing that we did was to read it early and read it right, and to help them particularly with the NLAWs, the anti-tank weapons in the early days. Those were very important.
But given the constraints that there may now be on government spending, do you fear a curtailment, a limiting of the resources going to Ukraine?
No, I think that obviously there's a practical limit on what we can give, both in munitions and financial support, but we will continue to. I've absolutely no doubt the Conservative government will continue to be very supportive and very generous, because this is.
Should they commit to the 3%?
This is pivotal for our future.
Do you think they should commit to the 3% of GDP on defence spending by 2030? I think it is.
I pointed out that under our current commitments, we're good. I think we're already at 2.4%. We're going to go to 2.5%. We continue with AUKUS and FCAS and the Future Combat Aircraft System and various other things. We're going to be spending a huge amount on defence. Whatever happens.
What about the commitment to the British public? A poll we have tonight suggests people are committed to support Ukraine, but that support weakens significantly if it means higher energy bills. What would you say to the British public?
I think I really understand people's pain or anxiety about energy prices and the misery everybody's been going through. But I would just say to people that this is a chance for us in the UK, actually in the whole of the Western world, to get off our dependence on Russian hydrocarbons and build a more secure future for ourselves, in which we rely on our own domestic production of renewable energy, or indeed nuclear energy, and have a totally different future. So the truth is, and this is why I'm very optimistic about what's happening, I think that actually with every week and every month that goes by, we become more resilient, more capable of providing for our energy needs, and less dependent in the future on Vladimir Putin.
How worried are you that Russia hacked the personal mobile of your Foreign Secretary and quite possibly got details of dealings with Ukraine?
You know, we never talk about security issues.
But I mean, that must be a worrying thing that it happened in your government.
We never talk about security issues, as you know.
Is that why it was suppressed? You didn't say anything about it at the time. It wasn't.
But Mark, you're guilty of what's called petitio principii. You're asking me to discuss something which I've said I won't discuss, and we don't talk about security issues.
Okay. So finally, you would like to stay involved with Ukraine. What kind of? Have you spoken to Rishi Sunak about a possible role?
I think what I can do and what I will want to do is to continue to champion the cause of Ukrainian freedom, of a free, sovereign, independent Ukraine. It is a great cause. I think it's a cause that has mobilized a phenomenal level of support across the UK.
But would you like a formal role? I mean, do you see it?
I'm happy with doing what I'm doing.
A kind of envoy role?
I think you know, this is my job is to talk up what I think are the immediate needs of the Ukrainians. If I could just repeat that key point for our viewers, I think what I'm sure your brilliant correspondents, who've done, by the way, a fantastic job throughout this war, I think what they would agree with, they need more help in taking out those drones and those missiles.
Will you go back to Ukraine?
Inevitably, but I'm not certain. I'll let you know before I go. But yeah.
Last two. Do you feel more appreciated on the world stage than you do domestically? And is that one of the reasons you're going to go to COP27?
I have an absolute passionate belief that the war in Ukraine, Putin's act of aggression, is something that we shouldn't accept and shouldn't tolerate. I think that I can continue to campaign for Ukraine out of office, and that's what I'm going to do.
Are you going to go to COP27?
Yes, as it happens, but that's not relevant to Ukraine.
And final question: I mean, do you still harbour hopes?
I was invited by the Egyptians. So I'm very happy to go.
So you go.
Yeah.
And you presumably think the Prime Minister should go?
No, I think the Prime Minister's doing. As he's pointed out, he's got a massive amount to do. We've got to sort out a huge agenda. That's what he's getting on with. I happen to have a particular interest. I was at the Glasgow COP, although it's become unfashionable to talk about it, was a fantastic global success. We did a huge amount of good for the planet. I want to talk a little bit about how I see things and how we see things in the UK.
And do you still harbour hopes of returning as Prime Minister? Is it unfinished business?
Mark, you promised this was going to be about Ukraine. I harbour hopes of continuing to campaign for for Ukraine, and that is my priority. And there are various other things I'm doing, but that is a cause that is very dear to my heart.
Boris Johnson, thanks very much. Thank you. Boris Johnson there. Let's get the views of our panel on that interview. Deborah, what did you make of what he had to say?
Well, yes, he is the former Prime Minister, but his words on Ukraine count because of that uniquely special relationship that he still has with Volodymyr Zelensky. I mean, the fact is that when Russia launched its invasion on the 24th of February, the very first foreign leader who the Ukrainian president picked up the phone to was our British Prime Minister. And he also chose, before the war started, he chose to support Ukraine. And the UK, like you said, was this leading voice that not only was actually actively putting in weapons itself, was also pressuring European allies and crucially was pressuring the United States. Yes, Joe Biden has acted very strongly and given huge, significant, overwhelming support to Ukraine. But that wasn't guaranteed. And I think the fact that you had a British Prime Minister that was so forward-leaning right early on moved away any avoidance of doubt and confusion on the US side. And you saw the US as well acting. So the UK played this fundamentally important leadership role under Boris Johnson, whatever you think of him domestically. And there is a concern, regardless of what Boris Johnson might say about this seamless support for Ukraine of the UK government, that under a new leader, that special chemistry won't be there anymore. And what will happen then?
I want to talk to the Ukrainian ambassador in just a moment about what Boris was saying. But Michael, just pick up on this issue that Boris Johnson seemed very concerned about, which is this, ongoing commitment as a difficult winter draws in for many European countries when it comes to energy and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, from here on in, it gets much tougher. It felt tough already. But actually, from here on in, it gets harder for the West because we've now got to maintain this consensus, which has been considerable. It's surprised most of us, to be honest. But it gets harder as we go through the winter. If we get to the other side of the winter, then it'll be an awful lot easier because the pendulum really will start moving against Russia at that point and back towards Ukraine in, I think, a more fundamental military sense, notwithstanding the fact that the Russians will undoubtedly launch a big second offensive probably in the spring. But getting through the winter is a tough thing. It's been astonishing. In a way, I was writing at the time that it's a new world since Thursday when we had the invasion. And Europe has remade itself. There was the EU engaging in sanctions, powerful sanctions that nobody thought they would do. Nord Stream 2 was off the table. Nobody thought we'd do that. There was the United States playing the transatlantic role. There was Britain playing its traditional role, which we feel that we're good at, as a bridge between the Europeans and the other Europeans and the United States. NATO was remarkably consensual, remarkably effective. All of a sudden, Europe and the transatlantic relationship was working the way it was supposed to work. And I was saying to myself, this is wonderful. How long will it last? Well, it's lasted longer than we thought because the political leaderships are still in lockstep with each other. But they've not really come under concerted domestic pressure. Now, it may happen in the United States after the midterm elections next week. It may start to happen in Germany and France as the winter really bites. It's certainly happening in southern Europe, where things are different in Hungary and Greece and Cyprus and so on. They take different views. But Britain is, along with the North Europeans, Britain, Poland, Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Scandinavians, Canada, the United States. This is a new sort of North European transatlantic NATO. It might turn out to be the core of a new NATO. I don't know. But those northern countries are holding the consensus together. So it's really important that what Boris said there turns out to be true, that he has set a role, and history will, whatever history says about it, and I think history will be pretty harsh on him on most things, but on this, history will be fair to him and it will be kind to him. Because on this, he's set Britain in a direction which I think will help to influence everybody else.
OK, in the audience is the Ukrainian ambassador, Vadim Pristaiko. Good evening to you. I just wonder what you made of what struck you about what Boris Johnson had to say.
Nothing struck me, actually, because we had these conversations, and with the Prime Minister as well. And you remember that he was not just coming 3 times through the war in Ukraine, he actually came just before the war, which allowed us to have an open conversation, adult conversation between President Zelensky and Prime Minister, and actually prepared us. We received this anti-tank rocket just on time, because this conversation happened. And I have to tell you that he's right that he had a personal attachment to Ukraine. I have to remind you that the previous prime ministers, the last one bilaterally came in 1996. So we didn't have much of the cooperation between the UK and Ukraine. And suddenly, just because of his, we just got lucky that we have this particular person being a prime minister of yours. But at the same time, we understand that he is just a spearhead of the whole effort, of the whole, I was trying to explain to Ukrainians many, many times why UK is so supportive. I hear in this series that you're supporting fair case, but so many nations do. I know that you're supporting underdogs, but there are some nations also doing it. Very difficult to explain to Ukrainians what even the notion of an underdog, we don't even have the word specific to this term. But actually that's because the UK came to us and so many nations, came afterwards, being sort of led, coordinated and helped. I believe that many prime ministers, this is a conversation, I understand discussion, whether somebody will be on the level of Prime Minister Johnson. I don't believe the Ukrainians will have a toys and a cake of Boris Johnson named after Boris Johnson, but that's what we expect your new prime ministers to find, something better than just cakes being named after them.
Has Rishi Sunak given you any commitments?
Rishi Sunak, just a very recent addition to your prime ministerial sort of leadership. I hope that sometime Liz Truss will come because she was very instrumental as a foreign secretary. She has this role to play. I hope that she will be playing. I don't believe that all prime ministers have to play the same role, but the new prime minister, the most important part has been discussed already, how much money you will be able to set aside from your own internal problems, which I am respectfully difficult to understand that too.
Okay, Ambassador, thanks very much. We'll see what Liz Truss gets up to next. But if there's anybody in the audience who wants to make a point about what they've just heard, what Boris Johnson was saying, or want to ask a question to the panel, please think about that now. We'll take those questions in just a second. I just want to ask Carl, the whole point during that interview of the possibility of Putin using some sort of tactical nuclear weapon, the fact we're having this conversation in the 21st century kind of beggars belief.
It does. I think the most interesting thing is how these conversations fit into the wider pattern of messages and signals sent and received. So we have a tendency, I think, to think about when we ask journalistic questions of former prime ministers that somehow we're not taking part in that world of messages sent and received. What I think you heard there, if you think about an anniversary that we've just gone through the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, so a few days ago, very fortunately 60 years ago, a few days ago, the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. If you think what we know now about the level of conversation, the multiple levels of signals sent and received, either both overtly through the media, through journalists, through making statements that were approved and not approved, the things that we know now about those efforts to avoid what John F. Kennedy called, the danger of accident, miscalculation, or madness, which would be, that would be one of the three reasons why we plunge into nuclear disaster. I think it's really interesting when you hear somebody interviewed who was in a position and is now having a slightly different position, to think about why things are said in a certain way and how that will, in 10, 20, 30 years, when we have a greater understanding of what's going on behind the scenes in the diplomatic back channels that Jake Sullivan talked about at the Pentagon, that's where we'll start to see exactly what the meaning of conversations like the one you just had was. And I think it'll be fascinating to see.
Okay, Carl, thanks very much. So is there anybody who wants to make a point at this stage in proceedings, or Mark, Francois?
Mark Francois, former Armed Forces Minister, now serving on the House of Commons Defence Committee. Just to back up what Deborah said about warnings from Britain and the US, on the 6th of January, a debate took place in the House of Commons on Russian strategy. And in that, a number of members of the committee, both Conservative and Labour, effectively predicted that Russia was likely to invade. We never got the date and the time, but we said they can really do this. So people already in Parliament were calling for attention to what might happen. We were laughed at. We were said that we were a bunch of hawks, you're all soldiers, you always say that the Russians are coming. Well, in the words of Nigel Farage, they're not laughing now. And I think, in fairness to Boris, whatever people think of his domestic record, he has provided leadership among European NATO nations on this issue, I think ably supported by people like Liz Truss and Ben Wallace, who I think has played a blinder as a defence secretary. And I think Britain has played a fundamental role in supporting the people of Ukraine, not just militarily, but also, if you like, morally, and bringing the world's attention to the barbaric Russian invasion. So hopefully we have done our bit and will continue to do so. And that includes spending 3% of GDP on defence.
Yeah. OK, Mark, thanks very much. Anybody with a question they would like to put to the panel or anything they'd like to say? Yes, sir.
What if Putin, we hear a lot of things that he's ill. What if he doesn't care about the future and he just decides, drop the bomb? That's how I want to be remembered.
OK, well, look, this is an interesting question you bring up, Vladimir Putin. I think we can go to Moscow, in fact, to try and get a view from Moscow. Do we have the screen? I'm not sure the screen's working, but I think that we can talk to Diana Magne in Moscow. Is that right? Diana, good evening, and thank you. And we've just had a question about what really comes down to, I suppose, you know, the rationality of Vladimir Putin. I mean, what is the feeling in Moscow? What are Russian people thinking on that issue?
Well, I don't think Vladimir Putin is mad. He is a rational actor. And therefore, there are many things that he may be trying to carve out for his legacy, such as getting back as much of Ukraine as he can. But leaving a nuclear legacy, if he doesn't absolutely have to, I don't think, and I don't think many people here think that he is prepared to do. I think Vladimir Putin understands the value of a nuclear arsenal is not in using it, it is in its deterrent factor. And so all the way along, we've heard angrier nuclear rhetoric when his army's doing worse, and different messaging when it's not. And, you know, if you look at Russian military doctrine, for example, on how to manage, de-escalate and escalate conflicts, you'll see that they talk about using conventional non-nuclear strikes, say on infrastructure, which we're seeing across Ukraine at the moment, coupled with nuclear threats, complemented with the threat of using a possible tactical nuclear weapon, and that is the way of trying to calibrate how your adversary will respond to you. And I think that Putin is trying to do that. And it will depend on how things go on the battlefield, because I think the assessment in Western capitals at the beginning of this war was that the likelihood of nuclear disaster was much smaller than it is now, because the assessment was that the Russian army would perform much better than it seems to have done. And we'll have to see how the winter goes. You know, the latest messaging from Vladimir Putin was essentially a message to the global south, saying it is the West who's using nuclear blackmail against us. I'm not a big, bad, nasty guy. I would never use it. But I think if that is a message for China, India, to suggest that it's the West at fault here, and for his own people. But I think if he feels really backed into a corner, and if his troops are facing a catastrophe, he might be pushed to other mechanisms. Because I think fundamentally the point of the nuclear threat is to try and force either the ground in Ukraine to be frozen as it is, or that the West forces Volodymyr Zelensky to sit down and talk, which would be madness for Ukraine now, seeing as it is gaining ground on the battlefield.
And Diana, we hear talk a lot about what Ukrainians are thinking about the progress of this war. What are Russians thinking? What are Muscovites thinking about the way things are going?
Well, they know now that it's not going according to plan, which was the messaging throughout the first 5 months, really. But, you know, you hear these mantras. Today I heard it again. What was Putin to do? For 8 long years, the children of Donbass have been bombarded. That kind of messaging that they get from state TV all the time. The decision to declare partial mobilization and send 300,000 young Russian men to fight has come as a significant shock, but it hasn't necessarily turned people against this war. It has just brought the war home to them. And, you know, I don't need to tell you how compelling and how hypnotic, really, state TV is, and how much it affects the national psyche here. And, of course, there are parties on each end who don't accept that messaging and who don't really want to have a part in any of this. And the percentages on each side of that may be moving, but essentially the middle ground of people here are on Putin's side. They think it is the West who's at fault for this entire situation. They know it's all going according to plan, but to a certain extent it's causing them to say, well, you know, we're all in. I don't think yet you're seeing some sort of turn in people's mood here. There's just increasing worry, increasing anxiety, increasing concern.
Okay, interesting stuff. Diana, thank you very much for being with us. Now, when I was in Ukraine, the foreign minister there said something very interesting to me. He said Ukraine was fighting a 21st century war and the Russians, he said, were stuck in the World War II trenches. In truth, the war in Ukraine has been a conventional conflict fought by troops in close combat, backed by tanks and missile strikes. But many factors also make this a modern war with intelligence and information reshaping the battle line. So let's talk about this. And Michael, in what ways do you think this is a different war, a modern war?
Well, it's modern in the sense that it covers the whole spectrum. So the Ukrainians are critically dependent on Starlink. Organization.
Elon Musk.
Which is exactly, Elon Musk's put 3,000 satellites there, which provide an unbreakable battlefield communication system, which the Ukrainians can use. And so on the one hand, this is space wars already important in our world. We always knew they would be. This is the first example where it matters. And then on the other hand, we're talking about good old-fashioned, deep down and dirty logistics, the ability of troops to cope with the mud, the ability of vehicles to move over wet ground, all the sort of things that are not just our fathers, but our grandfathers would have remembered from the wars of the 20th century. So in a way, this is a war that has, as we thought wars would in the future, stretched the conception of warfare, but both to the, as it were, to the top and to the bottom. We didn't think we would see it in a high-tempo war in Europe. We thought we'd see little bits of it in wars around the world, different sorts of wars about different things. But here is an all-out war, with one side struggling for its survival and the other side determined to do whatever it takes not to lose. Whether or not the Russians really think they can win now, but they are determined not to lose. And in that situation, we're seeing a war which is unique. And interestingly, we're seeing now the Ukrainians do what the British forces are telling themselves they will have to train to do. The Ukrainians are actually doing it. They're every day in and day out. On Salisbury Plain and at Shrivenham at the Defence Concept Centre, they are saying, we've got to learn to do all these things. Yeah, the Ukrainians are doing it. Very soon, we talk about training them. Very soon, they'll be training us.
Deborah, I want to just talk to you about the drones, because you saw, I think, a drone team firsthand. But Carl, just very briefly, pick up the point that Michael made. I mean, in many ways, this is about traditional warfare, the hard slog of war.
Yeah, and you know there is a fundamental truth about warfare in that it really ends with the use of kinetic weapons on soft human flesh. You know that's what we've been seeing over the last few months. That's the reason that we see these images on our screens, and the reason that they are so distressingly familiar is because at the very sharp end there are basically two battlefields that are attempting to be won. There's the battlefield on the ground, and of course there's the battlefield in people's minds, which is the other area where we now see all of these sort of innovations into the hybrid warfare in terms of the way in which the social media is co-opted and all of these kind of things. But fundamentally, it's attempting to do the same thing. It's attempting to win effectively a kind of spin war both at home and abroad, and then win a very traditional war on the battlefield, which involves the creation of loss. You know, Peter Taylor talked about this in Northern Ireland. The common denominator is loss. And that's been the same across the whole...
I mean, this social media, there's almost a social media army in Ukraine. I mean, these civilians portraying what's happened to them as, sort of stalwart survivors, the Russians are the aggressors. It does have an impact on social media. It's often picked up by journalists.
And it's the speed with which that sort of information is transmitted that's different, not necessarily the fact that that information is people desire that information to get out. There used to be that the reliance was on journalists. It used to be that the reliance was on letters home, the types of things that we have in our collection. Yeah. But the way that permeated into the consciousness was much, much longer. And now, of course, it's a very rapid and evolving daily thing.
And, I mean, critically, to war crimes. Because at one time, war crimes evidence was captured after the fact, a bit of an afterthought. Now, from day one, there is evidence of war crimes, and that evidence is there in the digital archives. It'll be there forever. It'll be there in 50 years' time. It'll be there in 100 years' time. It cannot be burnt. It cannot be destroyed. It's there from day one.
Well, it's a very interesting point. And there's so much of this stuff. I should just say there's so much of this stuff that the whole question of what is real, what is true, verifying this stuff. I mean, we have a unit at Sky News that is constantly examining data and analysing pictures to make sure they are what they say. I mean, that is a really important part of this. But I don't know what it was you wanted to say, but drones, I want to just get... because you did spend time with a drone team, and drones have played an interesting part in this war.
I will just say my little thing, if that's okay. I think it's really important about how the Ukrainian military has used social media as well, and on the Russian side. There's so many sort of catchy little videos that the Ukrainian Defense Ministry's Twitter feed pumps out. That again, it's part of it's the influence operation that is another dimension in warfare, and the Ukrainians are masters at it in terms of shaping the narrative. When you had the counteroffensive that was launched on the 29th of August in the south against Kherson and then against Kharkiv, the Ukrainians completely shut down the front line to journalists. They absolutely blocked anyone getting approved access. And instead, the only images that we really saw were those that were released by Ukrainian soldiers as part of that offensive. And it was in a powerful way of controlling the narrative, controlling what we're seeing.
And a difference in drones in a minute. But there's a difference in approach between Zelensky, these nightly addresses to the people of Ukraine and the impact that has, and Putin.
Yeah, on his long table.
Who's the long table, the speeches once or twice every month or something, long speech. I mean, there's a big difference.
Yeah, and I remember when Volodymyr Zelensky made his first big press conference after the siege around Kyiv had been defeated. And he's obviously like, do you remember he was told at the beginning by the Americans to get the hell out of Kyiv, and he was like, give me bullets, not a ride. He is a wanted man. There's a big target on his head. And yet he suddenly appeared in this underground station in the center of Kyiv with this huge kind of media crew with like cameras everywhere. And he came sort of like walking down this elevator, and there's all of us journalists kind of sitting out. We all had little signs to kind of pop up if we wanted a question. And he sat there and he fielded questions for about 2.5 hours. It was incredible. And it's all about information. It's all about influencing. It's using that information to convince Western leaders to keep on giving weapons to Ukraine when their own populations are suffering.
It is such an important part of this war.
We can talk about drones, if you want, very quickly.
Drones.
So drones. It's fascinating for me as a defence journalist that's covered defence for a long time, spent time in different war zones, you hear about the use of drones, and they have become such a fundamental weapon in the war. Yes, there's lots of elements of battle, trenches, tanks, artillery, and yet you suddenly have, for the first time, really, in this kind of comprehensive way, drones being used to call in artillery strikes, to pick out targets. We're talking a bit about cyber as well, like the UK today revealing the secret support that it's been given to Ukraine to fend off a massive cyber war that we don't see but is going on, and how the Russians are using, for example, getting into CCTV networks to be able to see where targets are, using that to then call in strikes to hit targets. And obviously, the Ukrainians are doing that in return. It's a sophisticated but also very simple way. If you think about it, drones, you can get them very cheaply. They are pumping these things out. The head of the armed forces, our military chief, said the other day that the UK has given something like 30 different types of drone to Ukraine as it tests which ones are best. And these are, it's levelling the playing field, but also it's very scary. And you said, like, being out in like a sort of frontline area in Kharkiv, hearing that sound of a drone overhead, and knowing that artillery could then be pulled in to your position is pretty frightening.
Mark, we've got loads of air power expertise in the first couple of rows of the audience.
Oh, yes,
and they know very well that you can spend billions of dollars on air superiority, as we've done for 50 or 60 years. But from now on, you will never control the airspace below 5,000 feet, because that's where the drones go. Yeah. And so you can play for air superiority, they all know it, but below 5,000 feet belongs to the drones.
OK, Michael, thanks very much. Thank you all just for the moment, because time is moving on, and it all really brings us to the big unknown question. What could happen next? How long could the fighting rage on for? Can meaningful negotiations begin? And if there is a ceasefire of sorts, how could it work? Will it work? Carl, I want to start with you. I think it was Mark Twain who said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. What can we learn from previous conflicts that may instruct or inform what could happen in Ukraine?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that we can sort of bring up that we've already talked about. And I think one of the crucial issues is the way in which we can identify certain elements of a playbook that, as I say, authoritarian rulers will often use, both in terms of, and we talked about, the kind of the establishing a pretense for an invasion by loudly proclaiming about one's own citizens, or kin of one's own citizens being involved and being kind of suppressed or oppressed, and that's the way that you justify those kind of incursions, those kind of assaults, those kind of expeditionary warfare. That's obviously a kind of classical playbook, but it doesn't kind of get you to the end point. It doesn't tell you how those kind of things end. I think broadly speaking, what that kind of the echoes that we will see having the most resonant impact are going to be the ones around the simpler aspects of what provides those kinds of off-ramps for people in conflict. We've already seen what resilience will do, how resilient the Ukrainian people have been. We've already seen how that kind of is almost related generationally to the experience of the Ukrainians. I think Ukraine's own history also offers some powerful pointers. This is a country that, another proverb, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. Ukraine has been one of those countries that has been fought over for different reasons. And for that reason, I think the people of Ukraine sort of have a great sense of what independence actually means, that it's been so hard fought for, that they have a history that includes genocide, that includes the Holodomor, that includes all of this tremendous suffering. I think the pointers from those aspects of history are around the fact that people who wish to see their freedom maintained will invariably fight incredibly hard for it.
Right, we have a question, I think, about what's going to happen next from Philip. If you could put your hand up, Philip, you had a question? Yeah. What was your question? Because I think, Michael, you might be best placed to answer this.
Well, I think we've touched on it. How does the panel think that the onset of winter will change the campaign for both sides, and what might be the possible consequences?
Yeah, well, I think winter, as you say, changes the campaign, makes it intrinsically easier to be defensive rather than offensive. But it works both ways. It helps certain things in an offensive way because the ground goes harder for armoured vehicles and so on. But in general, I think battles never go in a straight tempo, and it's impossible to imagine this war carrying on at this intensity indefinitely. So I think it'll go up and down. My guess is that it'll certainly run into next year. I think my guess is, it is a guess, that there'll be an unstable ceasefire in place, which will probably favour Ukraine more than we thought it would have a couple of months ago. And that ceasefire may last for, a few months or whatever, and it'll probably break down. I think, this is the second Russia-Ukrainian war. The first was in 2014, the first land grab that Russia committed. This is the second war. I think there'll probably be a third war and a fourth war, because this, as we say, is an existential issue between Ukraine and Russia, and I guess it will go for 20 or 30 odd years. And it'll be an on-off conflict. which is why we've got to start to think about it in the West. This matters to us terribly. It matters hugely to us and to the stability and prosperity and freedom of Europe. And so we've got to be prepared for that and to think that through. There won't be a peace deal sometime next year and then we can all forget about it for a while. It won't be like that. This is an ongoing conflict which will flare up and maybe die down and flare up and die down for a generation.
Any other questions? We're running out of time slightly, but anybody got a question about what could happen next? Yes. Yeah, put back
Hi.
Sorry.
My name's Elizabeth. I just came back from Ukraine. I've been out there for 7 months, primarily in the Donbass. Just to pick up from Michael's point just there, which is possibly more of an observation, but I'm interested to hear all of your thoughts. We are all very lucky that we are across the Channel and we are the far side of Europe. But Ukraine is actually much closer than all of us think. I drove out there on my own in my little Peugeot in 2 days. That is how close it is. And it's another 2 days from there to where I live in Pokrovsk, in Donetsk. Now, according to Putin, I now live in Russia. But what I think is slightly strange in the UK is that we do not all necessarily realize how fragile our existence here is, how this is right on our doorstep, and how very quickly, if these things become more unstable, this can affect us here, much more than people worrying about energy bills or food bills. And us paying those fuel bills and those food bills are us fighting a war in the only way that we currently at home currently can. So, as I say, that was more of an observation than a thought, but I'm interested to hear what you all think.
So, well, thank you very much for that thought. And I mean, Deborah, how do you see the coming months?
It's such a fundamental point that you make, and I think that's the real challenge for the West. Russia is on a war footing. The head of GCHQ the other day sort of talked about how Russian rockets were running out. I'm sure Russia's industrial base is also on a war footing. And yes, they're heavily sanctioned, but we're doing everything possible to be able to replenish stocks. What's the West doing? Where is the action on behalf of Western industry in terms of rebuilding stockpiles of weapons, of ammunition that have been eroded ever since the peace dividend that was reaped following the end of the Cold War? And it's really interesting listening to the political narrative now over the course of the last few weeks, where the politicians, the previous Prime Minister and the current Prime Minister, economic strength, economic growth in order to increase defence spending. It's completely the wrong way around. If you don't have security, you don't have anything else.
Okay.
And I think what's happening in Ukraine really underlies that, and we all need to wake up to it.
Okay, Deborah, thank you very much, and to you all, thank you very much. Well, when I covered the war in the Balkans, I honestly thought I would never see war in Europe again in my lifetime. I'm sure many people felt the same, but how wrong we were. In April in Kharkiv, I spoke to a man who lost his young wife in a missile strike on the city. This, he said, this cannot be happening in the 21st century. We are a modern, independent country and differences should not be resolved by war. This is madness, he said. He is, of course, right, but the madness knows no sign of ending. That's it for tonight. Thank you to our panel, our audience, and everyone at the Imperial War Museum Institute. The work they do here to document past conflicts allows future generations to help understand the sacrifice. From all of us here, good night.